What's up, TUMNAD lectures? In this video, we are looking at what we call the systemic circulation. If this is your very first time to watch me, please make sure you like the video, comment down in the comment section, and please subscribe. Let's go ahead and get started. When we talk about what we call the systemic circulation, we need to first understand what is systemic circulation. Systemic circulation is going to be that kind of the circulation which involves the movement of the blood from the heart into the body tissues and then back to the heart. Okay, that's the general term one we call of the systemic circulation. Systemic circulation can also be called the greater circulation, or even also it can also be called the peripheral circulation. Now, having seen all that, let's go ahead and get started and look what we call systemic circulation. But before we go into detail of what we call the systemic circulation, let's have just brief anatomy of this structure. We're going to be now having systemic circulation supply to the upper extremities and even also supply to what we call the lower extremities. Now, this one here is going to be like the different parts of what we call the upper extremities. And when we talk of the upper extremities, I'm mainly focusing on the following structures. I'm mainly focusing on what we call the head. I'm mainly focusing on what we call the head. I'm only focusing on what we call the neck, and even also what we call the upper limbs. Okay, so now when we talk of the upper extremities, I'm mainly focusing on those areas, plus some little bit of what we call the thoracic region, which are also going to be part of what we call the upper extremities. Okay, and then when we talk of the lower extremities, this is going to be constituting the biggest percentage of what we call the body structure. We're going to be having a couple of different structures. So having the GIT, what we call the renal system, and even also the lower limbs, the pelvic region. All those ones are going to be categorized under what you call the lower extremities. Now we want to see how systemic circulation, how they supply to from the heart, all those areas, how it's going to be happening step by step. Now, having seen that idea of the diagrammatic illustration, let's go ahead and get started and see where systemic circulation is going to be starting from. Now, systemic circulation, like as we said in the previous video about the pulmonary circulation, we said that the pulmonary circulation was ending in this kind of this chamber which we are calling the left ventricle, and it was the beginning of what we call the systemic circulation. So now our first kind of the step in the systemic circulation is going to be what we call the left ventricle. Okay, what happens that when the left ventricle contracts, it will squeeze the blood as if it has never squeezed before, and this blood will come and hit all these kind of these structures which we are calling the aortic semilunar valve. So now this one here is going to be now our second step. Now what happens that when this aortic semilunar valve opens, they allow the blood to move into one of the biggest kind of the artery in the human body, which we call the aorta. So now this one here is going to be now our third step in what we call the systemic circulation. Now, what happens is that when this blood reaches to what we call the aorta, we are going to be having ascending aorta, aortic arch, and then also have what we call the descending aorta. Now, what happens on aortic arch, we have three kind of great vessels which are going to be supplying the upper extremities. What are these three great vessels? We have the first one which we call the brachiocephalic trunk. We have the second one here which is called the left common carotid artery, and then the last one, number 3, which we call the left subclavian artery. These kind of the great vessels are going to be supplying the upper extremities. And we said the upper extremities of interest are going to be what we call the head, the neck, and even what we call the upper limbs. What happens is that these blood vessels are supplying oxygen-rich blood, nutritious-rich blood. What happens? They used up blood in all these upper extremities. Eventually, will get drained back into the heart, and then they will pass through what we call the superior vena cava. Okay, so now this is going to be now the drainage system of all the used up blood from the upper extremities. It will finally come back into the right side of the heart through what we call the superior vena cava, which is going to be a branch of what we call the right and then the left brachiocephalic veins. Okay, it's just such another beautiful. So now that is a brief overview of the systemic circulation in the upper extremities. Let's take much of the time on what we call the lower extremities, because it's going to be the big video. Okay. Now, when we talk of what we call the lower extremities, we are going to be looking at what we call the descending aorta, because the descending aorta which is going to be supplying what we call the lower extremities. Now, the question is, when this aorta reaches what we call the thoracic region, it gets baptized by the name called the thoracic aorta. When it reaches into the abdominal region, it gets baptized what we call the abdominal aorta. Now, what happens is that this kind of the aorta, as it moves and then start descending down, it was a very large artery, but it's going to start giving off small kind of the branches. Okay, so now you're going to be having now small arteries, which are going to be the branches of what we call the big kind of the artery we call the aorta. Now, what happens is that within the thoracic aorta, we're going to be having multiple of different kind of the arteries. Some of these arteries are going to be of what you call the subcostal arteries, the posterior intercostal arteries, the phrenic arteries, the esophageal arteries. All these kind of the arteries, they are going to be making sure that they supply oxygen-rich blood, nutrition-rich blood to what you call the thoracic cavity. Okay. Now, what happens is that when the blood in the thoracic cavity it is usually up, what happens is that that kind of deoxygenated blood has to leave the thoracic region. Now, the question is, how is the thoracic region drained? It is drained through a specific type of the venous system, which we call the azygos venous system. Now, the azygos venous system, we have a specific beautiful kind of the vein which is going to be draining the biggest percentage of the thoracic region, which we call the azygos vein. Now, what happens that the azygos vein is going to be draining the biggest percentage of the thoracic region, and it will drop this blood into what we call the superior vena cava. Okay, it is such a beautiful thing. So now its drainage system is somehow a bit unique because this kind of the azygos vein will move and eventually will drop this blood into what we call the superior vena cava. It is such a beautiful thing. So now, okay, so now this one here is going to be what we call our main azygos vein. Okay. So now what happens that this is what we call now the branches, what we call the thoracic aorta. Now, as this aorta moves down to what we call the abdominal region, we said it gets baptized by the name of abdominal aorta. Now, within the abdominal aorta, we are going to be having multiple of different types of branches. We're going to be having this big kind of this branch for the abdominal aorta, which we call the celiac trunk. Now, this celiac trunk is going to be giving off different kind of the branches. It will give off the branches like, for example, the common hepatic artery, the left gastric artery, and even also what we call the splenic artery. These kind of the arteries are going to be supplying different areas. The liver is going to be supplying what we call the parts of the stomach, parts of what we call the spleen, the pancreas. Those all the structures are going to be supplied by what we call this kind of the small kind of the branch from the aorta they're calling the celiac trunk. Now, within again with the abdominal aorta, we're also going to be having what we call the superior mesenteric artery. And of course, the superior mesenteric artery is going to be supplying bigger parts of what we call the intestines, what we call the small intestine, like the duodenum, the jejunum, and then the ileum, what we call the cecum, the ascending colon, the transverse colon, especially the two sides or the proximal two sides of what we call the transverse colon. Okay, and then we also have what we call another branch which you're calling the inferior mesenteric artery, which is going to be supplying especially what we call the distal third of the transverse colon, and the descending colon, and the sigmoid colon, and then some upper parts of what we call the rectum. Okay, it is such another a beautiful thing. So now again, the abdominal aorta, as it moves down, we also have what we call another branch which we call the renal artery. Okay, so have the right and then the left renal artery. These arteries are going to be supplying what we call the kidney rich blood, you see, with what we call oxygen and what we call other kind of the nutrients. Okay, so now as this kind of the abdominal aorta descends down around the lumbar region L4, it is going to be bifurcating into the right and then the left common iliac artery. Eventually, these common iliac arteries will also go and then divide them more into internal and then external iliac arteries. They are going to be supplying all the different kind of the lower parts, like for example, the reproductive system, even also the lower limbs. So now, this structure here is representing what we call the lower limbs and even also what we call the tissues of the reproductive system. Okay? So now we have said that our step number 3 was the aorta, and then the aorta is giving off these small arteries which are going to be entering different kind of the organs. So now these ones here are going to be now our fourth kind of the step. Okay, these ones here are going to be now our fourth kind of the step. Now, our fifth step is that from the small arteries, we are going to be now, this kind of small arteries are also going to be breaking down into other tiny kind of the what we call the arteries, which we call the arterioles. So now from number 4, these are going to be now our what we call the arterioles. So now this one is going to be now our fifth step. Okay, and then from the arterioles, we are going to be having now exchange vessels, the smallest kind of the vessels, which we call the capillaries. These are the exchange vessels allowing the passage of what we call the nutrients, oxygen, even also what we call the wastes. So now these ones here are going to be now our step number 6. These ones here are going to be now what we call the capillaries. Now, after the capillaries, we have what we call the post-capillaries vessels, which are super very important. And these kind of post-capillary vessels are going to be what we call the venules. So now this one here is going to be what we call the venules. This one here what we call the venules. Now, what happens is that multiple of the venules are going to be coming together and they make what we call a big vein. Now, something which is very unique is that I won't take a little much of the time and explain the drainage system in what we call the GIT, because the GIT system is somehow a bit unique in its drainage ability. What do I mean by this? We have specific type of the vessels which we call the superior mesenteric vein, and even also what we call the inferior mesenteric vein, which are going to be draining different areas within the intestines. What happens is that they use that blood, which is going to be poor in oxygen and is rich in nutrients, will be driven by this kind of these vessels, and then they come over here and they drop in this kind of the big kind of the vein, which supplies 75% of blood, what we call to the liver. You know how this vessel is called? This vessel here is what we call the hepatic portal vein. So now, this kind of the hepatic portal vein is going to be allowing the drainage of the blood coming from the intestines, even also coming from the pancreas, from the spleen, from the stomach. All of it, they use that blood will pass through what you call the hepatic portal vein and they drop it to the liver. The liver will start running other metabolic processes and eventually it will lead to this kind of the vein which are calling the hepatic vein. So now, in that way, this hepatic vein is going to be now is going to be part of what we call the systemic veins, okay? And even also from what we call the kidneys, is going to be the renal vein, is also part of what we call the systemic vein. And even also from other parts of the lower extremities, they are also going to be what we call the systemic veins. And eventually, all these kind of systemic veins, which are going to be draining different structures within the GIT and other structures of the lower extremities, they will eventually drain into this big kind of the vessel, which is going to be the biggest kind of the vein in the human body, which we call the inferior vena cava. Okay, so now this kind of the biggest vein which drain the lower parts of the body is what we call the inferior vena cava. So now this one here is going to be now our step number 9. Okay, so now from the inferior vena cava and then even also superior vena cava, these one are going to be driving the blood from the lower extremities and then superior vena cava from all upper extremities, and they'll drop off in this chamber here. So now this one here is going to be now our step number 10, and the step number 10 is what we call the right atria. And then from there, some of the blood will move down through these valves here. You know how these valves are called? These valves here are going to be now our step number 11, and they are called the tricuspid valve. From there, once they open, they will allow the blood to move down into this ventricle, which we call the right ventricle. So now, when the blood reaches the right ventricle, this marks the end of what we call the systemic circulation, because when this blood leaves this kind of the ventricle and it pushes into this what we call the pulmonary tract, we are no longer in what we call systemic circulation. We have entered what we call the pulmonary circuit. Okay, it is such another beautiful thing. So now, having seen all that, let's put all that one in writing. We said we have step number 1 up to number 12. So now, step number one, we said it was what we call the left ventricle. Okay, it was what we call the left ventricle. Okay, and then we said that the left ventricle was squeezing the blood as if they had never squeezed before to hit these structures which we are calling the aortic semilunar valve. Okay, which we are calling the aortic semilunar valve. And then from there, this blood was entering what we call the aorta. We have the ascending, the aortic arch, and then the descending. So now the third portion was what we call the aorta. Okay, what we call the aorta, one of the largest kind of the artery in the human body. And then from there, our first point was this kind of the small arteries, which are the branches of the aorta. So now the first step was the small, was what we call the small arteries. Okay. And then also now the fifth step was the small arteries was branching into other tiny structures, which we are calling the arterioles. Okay, which we are calling the arterioles. Okay, and then arterioles are also going to be now breaking further into other kind of the tiny of the vessels, which are the exchange vessels, which we call the capillaries. Okay, so now our sixth step is what we call the capillaries. Okay, and of course with the capillaries, these are going to be the exchange vessels, allowing the in movement of nutrients and what we call oxygen gas, and then exit of what we call the wastes. Okay, it is such another beautiful thing. So now our step number seven was what we call the post capillary vessels, which we call the venules. Okay, so now our step number 7 was what we call the venules. Now multiple of the venules were coming together to make what we call systemic veins, which are draining individual organs. Okay, our step number 8 was systemic, what we call systemic veins. Now, multiple of the systemic veins are also going to be dropping the blood into the big kind of the vein, which we call the vena cava. Okay, so now our step number 9 was what we call the vena cava. And of course, when we talk about the vena cava, we are going to be having what we call the spiria, and then even also what we call the inferior. The superior draining the upper parts, and then the inferior draining the lower parts. It is such a beautiful thing. So after that, we're going to be having our step number 10, superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, dropping this kind of the chamber number 10, which we are calling the right atrium. Okay, which you are calling the right atrium. Okay, and of course the right atrium will allow the blood to move down after opening of this kind of the valves, which you are calling the tricuspid valve. So our step number 11 is what we call the tricuspid valve. Okay, and once the tricuspid valve opens, we allow the blood to move into this kind of the chamber. Number 12 step, which we call the right ventricle. Okay, which we call the right ventricle. Okay, and once the blood reaches what we call the right ventricle, we have successfully driven it from the left ventricle into the tissues and have brought back into the what we call the right side of the heart. Okay, and that is what we call systemic circulation. Because with systemic circulation, we are moving the blood from the left side of the heart into the entire body tissues, and we bring it back into the right side of the heart. Okay, it is such a beautiful thing. So that briefly covers what we call systemic circulation. So now, what is the functions of what we call systemic circulation? Now, systemic circulation plays a very important role. The first one is that it enables in delivery of what we call oxygen. Okay, oxygen is getting delivered to the tissues through what we call systemic circulation. Besides that, delivery of nutrients. All the nutrients received by these kind of different body tissues is just called the systemic circulation. Another thing is that all the waste products of metabolism are drained from what we call from the tissues, from what we call the systemic circulation. In that way, systemic circulation is also helping the transport of what we call wastes. Okay. And then to finish it all, also have what we call the enzymes and even what we call hormones. Once these kind of the molecules are produced, they're going to be moving through what we call the systemic circulation, and they go and reach their site of action, and then they run different physiological processes. Okay, so now that briefly covers what we call systemic circulation. So now in the next video, we are going to be taking through what we call the coronary circulation, which involves the circulation of the blood within the heart itself. Okay, so now TUMNAD, in this video, we have covered what we call systemic circulation. If you think whatever you have talked is making sense, is adding to you, you are benefiting, please, you can support it. And that can be done by a couple of means. You hit the like button, comment down in the comment section, and please subscribe. As always, TUMNAD, until we meet next time.